I'm joined today by Max Rashbrooke, who is a New Zealand-based writer and researcher. His most notable works include Inequality, a New Zealand Crisis, and Government for the Public Good, the surprising science of large-scale collective action. He also collaborated on works such as Wealth Inequality Tower and the Inequality Calculator. He is a senior associate of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies. Sir, it's an honor to interview you on the topic of democracy.
Very pleased to talk to you.
I want to start with the simplest yet at the same time probably the most complex question. How do we define democracy? What does it mean to you?
It's a very good question, and look, and there's lots of different definitions out there. It's such a big thing, democracy, that I think often it's hard to summarize it in one sentence. But I guess, you know, in a technical sense, democracy is about everyone as an equal being able to have a say over the major societal decisions that affect them. That's probably a sort of bare minimum technical definition. I guess I would say in a looser sense, for me, you know, the definition of democracy is about trusting ordinary people to being able to handle complex decisions, because that was what was radical about democracy as an idea. If you go back over many hundreds or thousands of years, when previously, you know, the idea was you had to have a king to make great decisions, or some kind of, you know, dictator effectively. Democracy is the idea that actually, no, every single one of us can get involved in those big decisions, is competent to make them, that we can come together and make them jointly. That for me is the essence of democracy.
In your TED talk, you also use the term democratic technology. How do you define it? What does it mean to you?
That's a metaphor that I use to try to make this whole discussion seem a bit more comprehensible, because it can be very abstract talking about democracy, you know, and we've just tried to define it, but even doing that is quite complicated. So I use the term democratic technology because everyone is familiar with technology, right? And technological advances. We're all familiar with the advance represented by the automobile and the computer and the internet and the rest of it. So I think of sort of the stages of democracy's development like the stages of development of technology. So, you know, you go back thousands of years to places like Athens, but also India and the Middle East, and you have this idea of, you know, that sort of the technology at the time is, well, we can bring everybody together because we live in quite small societies, and they can literally make all the decisions themselves together. Then in the 19th century, in places particularly like England and America, but also elsewhere, you know, that the technology, the sort of the way of doing democracy at the time is to say that, well, countries are too big now for everyone to get together, so you elect representatives to do it on your behalf. And then in the 20th century, the sort of the democratic technology is, well, we have these representatives, but we also spend a lot of time scrutinizing them as citizens. We have all these forms of media and accountability bodies. And so the question is, well, what is the next kind of democratic technology? What's the next upgrade, the next step forward that, you know, make sure that democracy is actually fit for the 21st century?
I want to maybe change the topic a little bit, because in my research, I often came across the term democracy index, and the question popped into my head. Many experts often mention democracy index in their works. My question is, how can we rank countries by their democracy status? Is it even possible to create an objective ranking of democracies in the 21st century?
That's a very interesting question. Generally, those indices are put together by taking a whole lot of, you know, criteria, things that you might want to see in a country for it to be considered democratic. And because that's quite a complex question, you can have hundreds and hundreds of these criteria. And they're things like, you know, are elections sort of free and fair? You know, can anyone stand as a candidate? You know, do you have an independent body that's running the election that ensures it's free from corruption? Do you have an active media that reports freely? on elections? Can people get engaged in decisions in between elections? Is there a culture of political participation? Is politics free from corruption and bribery? Are there controls on lobbying and donations? So you can build up quite a sophisticated index, I think, from all those categories. Can that be absolutely objective? I think to a sort of degree of approximation, yes. I mean, I think those indices are very useful because I think we can genuinely say, there is a difference between, the quality of democracy and the people's ability to take part in those key decisions that I talked about, between a country like Afghanistan, say, and Denmark. I think those differences are real. Are they absolutely objective? No, probably not. I mean, I'm based in New Zealand, a country which has a very strong indigenous population, the Māori people, and they had and have ways of making decisions which were in many senses deeply democratic. They involve, long gatherings, very strong emphasis on people taking turns, having their say, a very strong emphasis on consensus. We'll stay here for as long as it takes to make a decision. Now, the European colonists of New Zealand wouldn't have recognized that as democracy. The indexes you're talking about, the indices, might still not recognize that as democracy. And yet I think it pretty clearly is a form of democracy. So those indices, look, they have blind spots and they have biases. I certainly don't think they're perfect. I think they could be improved. But I do think they still, at the level of a general level of approximation, they definitely still tell us something useful.
Why do you think we, especially in Europe, somehow feel the need to follow the democratic path? What makes democracy the most appropriate source of power? What do you think?
Well, I think because people have that fundamental belief in what I referred to earlier, the ability of other people to handle complex decisions. There are lots of problems with democracies, of course. No system is perfect. And, it's probably a bit like Winston Churchill's sort of famous definition, I think of capitalism as, the worst possible system except all the other ones that have been tried. I don't know, capitalism or democracy more generally, I forget what exactly. You think about, the idea that we now need a dictator or a monarch to rule over us and make decisions for us, has very little credibility, particularly in an era where people are far better educated, than they ever have been in the past, where we have mass education, mass secondary schooling, to some extent mass tertiary education. And I think democracy is also attractive because, the track record of other forms of government is so poor. People sometimes say, oh, look at China or Singapore, they're autocracies and don't they do an incredible job of things? Well, actually, no, they don't. Their record across the board is still greatly inferior to the best democracies, the best functioning ones, which are classically those in Scandinavia and in Western Europe. And you look at, autocracies will get things right every now and then, but not that often. And they also don't have a lot of inbuilt mechanisms to correct their mistakes, because you have an autocracy that is going to stay there, is trying to stay there forever and has no reason to admit its mistakes. Whereas in a democracy, you can hold people accountable even if they get things wrong. You can get them to change their decisions. You can throw them out of power and install a new set of people. So I think it's probably true what someone once said, that democracies don't necessarily make fewer mistakes than autocracies, but they fix them more quickly.
I think that most talked about cornerstones of democracy include inclusiveness and equality, citizenship, freedom of assembly, association, speech, and so on. And which one do you think is crucial for us to focus if we want to improve our democracy? Is there one?
I think there's a couple of things. I think we need to increase the extent of people's active participation in democracy. I'm very against that minimalist model of democracy, which says you vote in an election every 3 or 4 or 5 years, and that's your job done as a citizen. Because actually democracy functions so much better if people get involved in all the decisions that governments are trying to make in between elections. And so that actually democracy is done by citizens in conjunction with parliamentarians, not just devolving all the work to parliamentarians. So I think we need to increase people's participation, and that participation needs to be egalitarian and inclusive, to pick up on that term you used, because at the moment, some people, particularly people from my demographic, already participate quite a lot. People who live in poverty or in ethnic minorities participate much less. So we need to drastically address that deficit. But as well as increasing participation, I think we also need to increase the amount of what's called deliberation, which is just a technical term for high quality public discussion. Because you can have people getting much more deeply involved, participating much more deeply in discussions, in decisions, sorry. But if people aren't participating intelligently, if they aren't discussing the options with other people, if they aren't having to listen, to reflect on other people's views, engage with the evidence, and ultimately change their own mind, then their participation won't be very intelligent. It won't be very wise. We won't actually be drawing on the wisdom of the crowd. So for me, the key is to increase people's participation, but also increase the level of discussion that they engage in while making those democratic decisions.
And how do you think we can fight this electoral apathy? Well,
I think sometimes people are less apathetic than we might be led to believe. A lot of people aren't sort of purely apathetic. They just have a sense that their engagement won't make any difference. And up to a point, they're right to think that. If you live in poverty, or if you're one of the many people in Western societies who've done very badly out of the last 40 years, where globalization has seen the loss of jobs and the loss of a way of life, and neither part, sort of side of politics has really, has a convincing plan to do anything about it, you can see why people don't get engaged. So, we need a politics that responds to people's concerns, for one thing, that actually offers the prospect of a really good life for everyone. And we need a politics that operates very differently so that people know that their engagement will be meaningful. It's not just filling out a form on an online consultation that no one actually ever pays any attention to. So I think we need to build ways for people to engage that actually, where their participation means something and where there's really high quality discussion. So things like citizens' assemblies where, a perfectly representative group of people, maybe 100 people, gets together to discuss an issue in great detail and then make recommendations that politicians will actually implement. Or, participatory budgeting, which happens increasingly in European cities, where a proportion of a city's budget for new projects is put up and the public allocates it directly after discussing it deeply with each other, or crowdsourcing legislation where people can suggest their own ideas for bills that go in front of the country's parliament. Because those are all things where if people get engaged, they can see the difference that their engagement has made. And for me, that's crucial.
I want to ask you one more question about these cornerstones, of democracy, because we often say that democracy is in danger, perhaps. But do you think it's possible to decide which of these values, so it's freedom of speech, association, so on, is really in danger? Is it biggest risk? Is it possible?
I'm a little bit hesitant about the idea about some of the rhetoric around democracy being in danger. If you go back to some of those democratic indices that you were talking about earlier, people put huge stress on the fact that the number of sort of full democracies has declined in the last 10 or 20 years. Now that's true, but that number also increased colossally in the second half of the 20th century. So what we're seeing is a small decline from a very rapid democratization in recent history. And I think, you know, a little bit of fall after a big rise is just the natural part of sort of the teething pains, the growing of democracy, if you like. One example I often give is that there are local areas, cantons in Switzerland, where women only won the right to vote on local issues, or there is one canton in particular where women only won the right to vote on local issues in 1991. You know, now being able to vote is one of the most bare minimum, you know, criteria for a democracy. And Switzerland, we think of as one of the, you know, one of the sort of most advanced, most democratic societies. Democracy in that sense is only 30 years old. And you think about how many millennia humans have existed for. You know, we're only just starting to do this thing called democracy. I think it is so new. And I don't think we should expect it to go smoothly or to go perfectly yet. You know, we're like the toddlers of true democracy, I would say. It is so new, it is so young. So there will be these rough patches. That said, it is very dangerous and frightening what is happening in some countries. You know, the rise of autocracies like Viktor Orban's in Hungary. You know, the weakening of democracy in places like America. There isn't a single fix. You know, we do, partly its values. We do have to, you know, emphasize the value of democracy, point to its successes, point to how it can be made better. And we have to keep reinforcing all the values that underpin it. You know, so we have to keep defending voting rights. We have to keep defending free and fair elections. We have to keep, you know, supporting a free and active media. All these fundamental underpinnings have to be strengthened. But we also can't just keep defending the institutions of the past. And again, we come back to my point. You know, we need a new kind of democratic technology. We need a new upgrade that involves these things like citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting, because nothing can stand still. You know, and the institutions of the past aren't going to solve the problems of tomorrow. You know, we need new structures. We need new ways of participating if democracy is going to be revitalized and if it's going to continue to maintain its position in the public's affection.
I want to stay in Europe, maybe, and talk with you about the Ukrainian crisis for a moment, if that's okay, because this crisis is probably the first in Europe and in such scale since the fall of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. How do these tensions affect the Europe as we now know it now?
Well, I mean, that's a very complex question, and I should say I'm absolutely not an expert, you know, on foreign affairs or those kinds of issues. I think you can possibly see what's happening in the Ukraine as, you know, as part of that, you know, as part of that struggle around democracy, because, you know, Russia, of course, is an extremely autocratic state, you know, that you know, lacks many of the things, most of the things, indeed, that we would think of as being necessary for a country to qualify as democratic. You know, whereas Europe, for all its many faults, and I think the European Union, you know, is not nearly as democratic or as open as it should be, is still, you know, a more profoundly democratic area of the world. And, you know, and the contest there, you know, and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is an attempt to, you know, to shore up the credentials of an autocratic regime. And I think you could possibly even see it as the act of a regime, ironically, that is under threat, because, you know, I don't think that internally Putin and his regime are particularly popular. They're failing to deliver on a lot of the things that the Russian public wants. And so things like invading the Ukraine are a way to distract attention, to shore up the popularity of a not particularly popular autocratic regime. I mean, how the democratic world deals with that, I don't know. I mean, I'm not qualified to give advice on that because, you know, of course, you can't give in to autocracy, but, you know, do you want another really bloody war, you know, right on Europe's doorstep? You know, I don't think there's great appetite for that. And it may be that, Ukraine in the end is split into two, and you have a more, authoritarian eastern part of the country and a more democratic western part of the country, and we end up with a new dividing line between democracy and autocracy running through the midst of that country. But that's only my guess. It's very hard to see how it'll play out.
Yes, of course, I think no one wants to repeat the history, I think, especially the Ukraine. And I have this highly optimistic, probably, theory that the pandemic, this solidarity under unexpected circumstances that COVID is, may also translate into the revival of the sense of belonging to the community. Would you agree that COVID may surprisingly help democracies in that sense?
That's a very tricky question. It might do, and to some extent I share your optimism. The problem is that it also has divisive aspects, and certainly some countries, and I think Britain and America have certainly shown this, is that you can end up with big divisions between people who take COVID seriously and want to follow all the health measures versus people who are, I think overly focused on individual liberty and want to keep on with their normal way of life, even at the risk of endangering their fellow citizens. So I think there are both unifying and dividing elements that are present there. But I certainly think there is an opportunity for governments to use that experience of solidarity, yes, to bring people together, to implement policies which will foster inclusion and which will reduce poverty and therefore increase people's engagement in democracy, and in other words, for democracy to be strengthened over the long run. I mean, we also shouldn't forget that the measures taken to protect people during COVID were sometimes quite authoritarian. And I'm based in a country in New Zealand where we've had very stringent lockdowns for short periods of time, and we have very tough vaccine mandates, which means that a noticeable number of people have lost their jobs, are unable to go to restaurants and cinemas, are partially excluded from social life. Now, I think that situation is temporary, and I hope that those groups of people will come back together. And I am broadly optimistic about the future, but we shouldn't miss the, and those elements of authoritarian decision-making were absolutely justified, but we shouldn't, neglect the fact that there have been divisive and authoritarian elements of even the best responses to COVID, and that some measure of healing and bringing back together post-COVID, well, hopefully there is a post-COVID, will be necessary.
You probably answered my last question, which was, are you optimistic about the future of democracy?
Yes, I am. And again, because I look at the long term, to come back to one of my earlier answers. The Western model of democracy certainly isn't the only one, and I don't like the triumphalism that sometimes surrounds it. But if you take it at least as one powerful model of how to do things, you go back 100 years, 200 years, and there were virtually no democracies as we would recognize them, certainly in Europe. And what we've seen over that period of time is a huge increase in the number of people who have the ability to participate in the major society-wide decisions that affect their lives, which I come back to as that key sort of definition. We've had a huge increase in people's potential and their ability to participate. Over the last 100, 150 years, we've also, had a massive increase in people's levels of education. It wasn't that long ago, really, in the sweep of human history, that very large numbers of people were illiterate, and not even capable of taking part in democracy, again, in the Western sense. And so I look at that long run, or again, I mean, countries like Greece and Spain, I think we forget that absolutely within living memory, they were both military dictatorships. And they have sometimes their democratic culture, certainly has failings, can seem a bit thin around the edges, but they are nonetheless democracies. We have come so far, I think, in such a short period of time. If you look at the whole, sweep of human history. And so I am optimistic because I think we've done such great things. We've liberated so much human potential, and I think we will keep doing that. Yes, we're in a period in human history that can seem quite dark, and there are issues like climate change, which democracies haven't handled well. Although again, it's worth noting that autocracies handle those issues even worse. So there's no solution there. Again, we have to make democracies better. We have to make them more future focused. We have to make them better able to deal with these big creeping problems like climate change, like the extinction of species. But I think that we can do that. I think that's absolutely within human potential. And I actually think what's going to come in this century in terms of the new forms of democracy that we create is going to be really exciting.
And with this hopeful message, we will end our discussion. That was the What's in the Future interview, and I was joined by Max Rashbrooke. Sir, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the discussion.